appear to be clear, go ahead and ask. You know, we've got a kind of a short bit of time today, but I want to make sure that we hit the high spots on PCI compliance for the hospitality industry. And one of the things, I guess the first question to look at, you know, why PCI compliance and why the hospitality industry? I mean, where's, you know, what's driving this? And as we'll talk about through today's presentation, PCI compliance is something that everybody, every company that takes a credit card or a debit card as a form of payment has to worry about. And that includes those in the hospitality industry, hotels, restaurants, etc. What we have found over the past few years, both by some internal reporting as well as what we've read in the news, is that people in the or companies in the hospitality industry face a number of unique threats to PCI compliance, given the size of their networks, for example, different access points, etc., but also that, by and large, PCI compliance for those in the hospitality industry is a little bit of a mystery. Not in that people don't know it's out there, but there's kind of the question of how do you, as a hotel, for example, comply with the PCI requirements. And what we're going to talk about today, again, we're just going to go over what the PCI data security standards are and what they require, and kind of talk a little bit about specific risk points that face hotels and others in the hospitality industry. I think you can all see my desktop, so I'm going to apologize now if you end up seeing a lot of dialog boxes from my scrolling through or advancing the slides on this PowerPoint. But the PCI, you know, it's an acronym, and I think like a lot of times when you have lawyers involved, you get a little bit of an alphabet soup, but PCI stands for Payment Card Industry, and it's, you know, the big players, the big card issues. It's Amex, Discover, JCB International, MasterCard, and Visa. And they meet as a council and that talks about a number of issues, including this data security standards. These standards are incorporated directly by the card issuers to your banks as part of each issuer's data security compliance requirements. By extension, they apply to you because of the agreements that you sign with your banks, with the issuing bank or the acquiring bank, when you open and operate what's called a merchant account. So in that sense, the PCI data security standards are not, it's not something that you opt into, something that you are subject to by virtue of having a merchant account and by virtue of having this, what you would call a flow down from the Data Security Standards Council to as incorporated by each of the card issuers, which is then incorporated by the issuing banks, and it's in the fine print somewhere in the merchant account agreement that you will have executed with your bank. There we go. And there's three tests. It's, broadly speaking, it applies to merchants, and as a term of art, a hotel, a restaurant, any entity in the any business in the hospitality industry is going to be considered a merchant to the extent that it accepts a card, a credit card or a debit card, as a form of payment. You have to, in order to fall under the data security standards, you have to do one of three things. Either store cardholder data, like in a customer file, for example, or transmit it. You will transmit, you have a card swipe machine that transmits data, what they call cardholder data, between your company, your hotel, and the issuing and the bank. Or otherwise you process cardholder data. It's important to note that the data security standards, they apply to virtually every transaction. It's not just online transactions, and it's not just the point where, say, a person makes a reservation with a hotel online. It would also include paper transactions. So if you have a restaurant that issues receipts that are separate from the folio that someone would get when they check out, that's one area. If you have a gift shop, that again is going to run a credit card transaction separately from a guest folio that the hotel runs, that's another point. And again, there's no exceptions to compliance with the data security standards. There for a while was I would classify it as an urban legend that smaller or mid-sized companies, mid-sized merchants, were not subject to PCI data security standards because of the size of their business. And unfortunately, that is not true. And really, the one takeaway here is, if you're a merchant, and if you deal with what they call cardholder data, you are required to comply with the data security standards. If you're a boutique hotel with you have one hotel, say somewhere in Seattle with 10 rooms, or if you are Hilton or Walmart, the standards the standards apply equally to both kinds of companies. Now, there is a difference in terms of self-classification and some other things that attach to the volume of credit card transactions a merchant processes, but just keep in mind the threshold point that the data security standards apply to every merchant with no exceptions. Just a very quick note about cardholder data. In some ways, that definition is self-explanatory. It's the information, in essence, that is either read off the magnetic strip that's on the back of a card, or it can be deciphered based on an imprint of the front of the card. So it's account information, credit card number, the CVV number, etc. It's any information really that can allow either, in the first instance, the cardholder, but others to access and use the account, which is, again, when there is a breach, the focus will be on what data is there. Now, when we get back to, we talk about compliance, it is in many ways what lawyers would call a strict liability regime. And what I mean by that, and I've been involved with several representing merchants in several data breaches, including PCI investigations. And the approach that the card issuers, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, etc., the perspective that they take is one where if there is a breach and if cardholder data is compromised, then the merchant automatically bears some form of liability. And it is just a question then of how much and what happens to the merchant on a going forward basis. Now, your bank, your merchant bank where you have your account, is prohibited from indemnifying you, the merchant, in the event of noncompliance. So in essence, the bank, whether it's Bank of America or a neighborhood bank, they cannot tell you that, okay, we'll pay you back for any losses that you may incur by virtue of noncompliance with the PCI security standards. The other piece of this is that the card association, Visa, MasterCard, again by example, they require the merchant banks to monitor their merchant. And so what happens is many times if there is a breach, it is the merchant bank that gets the first indication of a potential problem. If they start to get a large number of customers complaining about unauthorized charges, what then happens is the merchant banks take that information, look at it themselves, share it with the card issuers, and then they try to determine what they call a common point of purchase. They ask the question, at what store or at what hotel or at what merchant were all these cards used? And that's how the card issuers and the merchant banks will narrow down their field of inquiry to a specific merchant. This requirement is contractual. You theoretically, I would say, have the option to not subject yourself to the PCI standards. I say theoretically because in a practical sense, I'm not aware of any bank that waives the PCI security standards. But it is a contractual responsibility. It is not born out of any law or regulation. Although I will say two things. One is many states, and my colleague Henry Chalmers, who I think is on the phone, does a lot of this work. There are a lot of states that have data breach notification requirements that attach to, if there's a breach of data security, what the merchant's obligations are in terms of notifying potentially affected customers. That is separate from PCI. We're not going to get into that in depth on this call, but it's something to keep in mind. The other piece of information to keep in mind is that oftentimes, at least it's been my experience, that when the issuers investigate a potential breach of the PCI data security standards, the Federal Trade Commission gets involved because even though there is no federal statute specifying data security or cybersecurity standards in commercial relationships, the Federal Trade Commission takes the view that the failure to provide adequate data security is a deceptive trade practice. And so what tends to happen in these investigations is that you have multiple layers of inquiries and multiple entities that you've got to respond to. Not just your bank, not just your merchant bank or the issuer, but the FTC in some cases and in some cases state regulators. All of which gets back to the central point of this presentation, which is you should treat compliance as mandatory, and you can and should reduce your risk of a data breach by looking at the 12 PCI data security requirements and then figuring out what to do in terms of your own network infrastructure. Now, the PCI Council, they've issued these 12 requirements, and they're very broadly set out. And the idea being that as a baseline point of compliance, merchants should do each of these 12 things, and you need to document how you do each of these 12 things both in a periodic review of your systems, but also as part of a forward-looking, what I would call a compliance program or a compliance policy. Now, I would say not most, but many of the issues, many of the breaches that affect hotels and others in the hospitality industry start at points 1 and 2, which is the obligation for you to build and maintain a secure network. You need to firewall off those parts of your network that either store or transmit cardholder data. A related point to this is that you only should keep cardholder data for as short a period of time as you need it. There are no specific timelines issued either by merchant banks or the issuers, in terms of how long you need to keep or could keep cardholder data on your system. You may keep it for a very short period of time. You may keep it for a couple days, depending on if a guest is staying an extended period of time. The general guidance that we get out of the PCI Council is that hotels, others in the hospitality industry, merchants generally, should only keep cardholder data for as long as they need to in order to effectuate the transaction in question. You should never keep cardholder data past that point in time. You shouldn't, as a rule, store cardholder data in some database. Because if you do, and if there is a breach, that will be considered an aggravating factor by the issuers in determining what penalties might apply to your hotel or company or to the merchant. Obviously, don't use vendor-supplied defaults for system passwords. You should, if you as you install and build out your network, you obviously change passwords, change security parameters to what you need them to be. Do not, don't make your password. Use what they call strong passwords that have, a combination of letters, numbers, symbols, and capitalized terms. You should never have your employees share a password. Don't have them write a password on a Post-it note and leave it at the front desk. That's another one. Now, requirements 3 and 4, obviously one is you protect stored data, which gets to the firewall issue, but also gets to number 4, which is encrypt the transmission of cardholder data across public networks. Now, the question is, what is a public network? The short answer in this context will be any network that is not within your hotel, your restaurant, or your company. It's probably a good idea to encrypt that data in any transmission, but it's a specific PCI requirement to do so when you send in that kind of information across a public network. Vulnerability management. Now, what this means is you need to regularly update the antivirus and software security patches, etc. I'm sure, I have a Mac, and every now and then I get a pop-up box that says, download this latest security patch. It's incumbent on each of you to ensure that your operating system, your antivirus, all of that is up to date, because if it's not, you give an opportunity to hackers, to people who are maybe phishing, to get into your system, and they can cause tremendous damage generally, but they can also use it to steal cardholder data. And when we say develop and maintain secure systems and applications, part of that answer is you need to map out what your network looks like. You need to map out the points of contact. Physically, where are the points of contact? Where are the routers? How do you keep if you, again, using the hotel context, how do you keep someone, I was going to say someone like me, but a guest who logs in to a Wi-Fi network in their room from getting into the operational networks, the back office network in the hotel. Again, part of this compliance starts with understanding what your network looks like, where the points of access are, and how you segregate and protect cardholder data, both for as long as you have it, but to the extent you need to transmit it from point A to point B. Access control measures. Again, you should not have every employee potentially be able to access cardholder data. You need to think about who needs to do it. It's going to be your accounting staff, if you have it, your front office personnel, the people who are interacting directly with the customers, but it's not going to be everyone. The other piece of this, assign a unique ID to each person that has computer access, and that really does mean every person. Don't share obviously unique IDs by the definition of the word unique means you don't share them, but you need to be able to understand and predict and review which specific people have access in your company, in your hotel, in your restaurant. You need to understand who has access to what parts of your network and plan accordingly. Another point is to restrict physical access to cardholder data. You often see, I've seen this in hotels where, when I check in, the hotel will have a folio ready that has my cardholder data on there. Now, the ways to restrict physical access, one of them is, as a lot of you know, is to use all X's to represent the card number except for the last 4 numbers. Also, physical access is going to mean keeping things under lock and key, keeping cardholder data, hard copy records in a secure location. Also, part of this is you have an obligation to monitor and test your networks. I can tell you that in one of the more recent PCI investigations that we've worked on, one of the central issues that the card issuers identified at the merchant in question was the fact that they had gone 18 months without having anybody scan their network, and that's a bad thing. You need to track and monitor access to your network resources as well as to cardholder. A lot of that comes with implementing strong access control measures. You also need to routinely test your systems. And part of this is going to be the scan as part of your self-certification of compliance that goes on. The last point here is kind of what I would say there's part of it that is papering an information security policy, but also setting what I would call the tone at the top, that your company, your hotel, your restaurant will not, you're going to do everything you can to protect cardholder data. And you're going to do that not just by saying that you're going to do everything you can to protect cardholder data, but you're going to do that by developing and issuing and updating and training on your information security policy. Now, there's a lot here, but let's talk about what your first steps are. We just went through the 12 PCI requirements. There may be some wrinkles or nuances or slight differences that may come from your payment brand or acquiring bank. Look through those and base your compliance strategy on a mix of those 12 general PCI standards as well as any specific requirements that may come from the brand or the acquirer. Now, compliance requirements, if we start at the point that everybody has to comply with PCI-DSS, the requirements in terms of your self-assessment questionnaire or your scanning process is going to be tiered based, there's 4 tiers based on the volume of transactions. Level 1 represents those companies that have the greatest number of transactions. It also represents companies that have had PCI compliance issues in the past. And that's one consequence of having an issue is that if you are, say, a level 4 merchant on the smaller end of the transaction scale, on the volume scale, and you have a PCI, a data security breach, you get bumped up to level 1. And that means your compliance obligations, the paperwork, the costs increase significantly. In general, if you're a level 1 merchant, you complete the self-assessment questionnaire. That's going to be true across levels 1 through 4. In essence, they ask you to, how many transactions do you process in a year, et cetera. Levels 1 and 2 at least require that you retain an approved scanning vendor to scan your system for your network for vulnerabilities, and then you submit that to your acquiring bank. Now, again, as I said before, it's in many ways this is strict liability, which requires strict compliance.
Michael, I have a question.
Yeah.
In reference to that scanning bit, is that contingent upon the volume that you do and whether or not you actually have to do that?
Yeah, that's going to be, in level 4 merchants, below a certain volume don't have to do that.
Okay.
Don't have to, and let me explain what that means. If you ask an acquiring bank, they would say everybody needs to do it. And there is an argument to be made that a vulnerability scan is a useful tool for everybody to understand, how their network is configured and what their vulnerability points are. But in terms of what's required for the 4 corners of PCI compliance, smaller merchants don't have to do it. Smaller merchants just focus on the self-assessment. Okay. Larger merchants have to do the self-assessment and the scan.
Okay.
Now, getting back to, I had mentioned before, a network diagram. This is crucial. I mean, one of the first things that one of the issues, that if there's a PCI issue, the issuer and or the merchant bank will ask for your network diagram. You need to be able to provide it. And it's not just, in my view, simply providing it, but understanding how data flows through your network and what the risk points, what are the vulnerable points in your network. All points of entry have to be identified and protected. And then the question is, what must you do? It's, you protect your stored data, you encrypt sensitive data, you encrypt the transmission, you restrict access on a need-to-know basis, and you mask the PAN as just the default thing. You should never, and this is where companies get into trouble, never store unencrypted credit card numbers. Certainly you never store a CVV, PIN blocks, or PIN numbers either alone or in connection or with reference to a credit card number. That is the holy grail for somebody who is looking to commit credit card fraud. And again, when I say never store, it gets back to my earlier point about you only need to keep this information for the shortest time necessary to complete the transaction. Once the transaction is completed, it's the view of the card issuers and the banks that you don't need the information anymore. Therefore, you shouldn't have it. Okay, I like the some e-cards. Tracy put that in without telling me, but I think it's also, it's a good point. I mean, you use strong passwords. Don't use defaults. Don't use shared ones. Don't allow people who access your network to use 1, 2, 3, 4 or password. It's whatever. Like we have at this firm, I'm sure companies have it too. Our passwords expire after a certain period of time. You're not allowed to reuse prior passwords, and you have to force the use of strong passwords. You need to change all the defaults before connecting any new device to your network. Remote access is also an issue, and there's a whole set of PCI standards that talk about remote access, but the gist of it is you need to have unique user IDs, strong passwords, and understand who and, more importantly, why somebody would need to remotely access your network. And what I mean by that is, it's not somebody in the lobby, but, somebody goes home or is traveling and they need to dial back in. Separate your guest and your employee or your operational networks. This again gets back to the firewall question, firewall suggestion. And keep your software updated. Again, it's security patches and antivirus software. It's an evolving game between merchants on the one hand and those who would steal credit card information or commit credit card fraud. Your Microsofts, your Apples, they can be allies in this, but you for Symantec, you've got to keep your software updated. Should be a no-brainer, but oftentimes doesn't happen. Person asked about scanning. I mean, one thing to consider doing is scanning for rogue devices. One case I was involved with involved the payment. There's the boxes that you find at the checkout at a retailer. Well, there was a way on the old on those old machines to take the machine, insert an old Palm Pilot into the machine, into the guts of the machine, put the machine back, and steal data. All of which gets to the point of, as you do your scanning, as you map your network, if there's something that doesn't look right, if there's a device that's accounted for that is somehow attached to your network, you need to investigate it. Your users should log off when they leave work. If you consider having an automatic log off if computer's not been used in a short period of time. Control physical access, and again, what you need to do is train your company, train your those employees that deal with cardholder data. This is not a one-off or should not be a one-off thing. You should do this at least on an annual basis and have those employees who need to be trained execute a certification that they've been trained at least once a year. And this is something that the issuing card issuers and the banks look for. Your compliance strategy needs to be an evolving and living strategy in the sense that it's an ongoing conversation between you and your employees and your customers. And keeping your employees updated and keeping your employees and your IT group and management all on the same page on this is crucial, and often makes the distinction between those companies that have had PCI compliance issues and those that haven't. And again, I wouldn't be a lawyer if I didn't tell you to paper things. But this is should be considered part of your ongoing record keeping and information management program. You need to have an acceptable use policy for your employees to access and use your network. If you need backups, get them. Understand what you need to do and what you should do in the event of, we say incident, but if there's a breach. Understand what how you should respond and how you're required to respond. To the extent you do scans or as you file these self-assessments, keep copies in your records so you can point to something very specific about compliance. To the extent you use third-party software, you should ask for a statement that the software is compliant with the relevant PCI standard. Because at the end of the day, it's still going to be you as the merchant that's going to be on the line in the event of a data breach. Even if you're using a third-party software, if you're using a third-party host, what doesn't, from where the issuers and the bank stand, that's irrelevant. You as the merchant are the first line of defense and therefore the first line of liability for PCI noncompliance. Potential costs, there's significant fines that attach, and it's a sliding scale depending on the number of cards stolen, circumstances surrounding the incident, whether this was an organized crime issue, what kind of data did you store and how was it stored, how open and quick were you in reporting the incident both to law enforcement and to the bank. But at a point we're talking up to $500,000 for Visa and MasterCard per occurrence. And that does not include the costs that they will impose on you by having a new vulnerability scan, a new audit done of your network. It doesn't include the cost of automatically being moved up to a level 1 merchant and all the related compliance requirements that attach to that. There's also out there reputational issues that can attach, to merchants who have PCI compliance issues, and then, et cetera, legal costs, et cetera. So, for a fraction of what a fine and related expense would be for a data breach, for a fraction of that amount, you can invest in training and programs and systems and policies at your company to make sure that a breach does not happen. And there's also, we were talking about the forensic investigations. There's some numbers here, but it's it's a significant cost exposure. And that was it. Again, this was the 30,000-foot view, and if you have any questions, shoot. If not, I think my contact information as well as Tracy's, they're both attached on the last slide. So if you have a question that comes up later, don't hesitate to reach out to us. But if there's any questions now, please go ahead.
Hi, Mike. I think Centrata had a question. The question is, why are brands such as Hilton, Starwood, and others reluctant to provide attestation of compliance on their network's compliance to franchises?
That's a good question. my sense, I mean, there's two answers here. One is, well, my suspicion on this is that they probably are pushing down compliance requirements onto the franchisees. And so they're going to, in the first instance, look at the franchisees to make sure of two things. One is that the franchisee's own network is secure, and then they will want to make sure that the links between the franchisee's network and say the Hilton network are secure. My sense is that they probably are pushing this down because they're going to say, well, we don't, the cardholder data is really the responsibility of the franchisee hotel.
Michael Damon here. I have a question. I work for a management company, and we have multiple hotels. Some of the hotels the management company also owns, and others they partner with everybody. How should, for classification purposes, when we go to be PCI compliant, should we be looking at the hotels individually as far as, okay, this hotel does this amount in credit card volume, so they're this classification, or should we look at all properties as one unit when classifying?
My inclination would be to say one unit.
One unit, okay.
Because, again, you're probably talking about a number of different networks, but
yeah,
the analogy I would draw is in the retail space, the card issuers have looked at, they will look at volume across the aggregate number of outlets that a retailer has, and so by analogy, I would say that they're going to look at the aggregate number. They're going to look at you as one entity.
Gotcha. And then as far as like responsibility, at the end of the day, even though we may manage a franchise property where I wouldn't have access to, let's say, the firewall because the franchise property, their IT department is the only one allowed to touch the firewall, we would still be required to make sure that they're doing whatever needs to be done in order to secure credit card data, correct?
That's correct. I mean, in that context, the franchisee-franchisor context, there's a wrinkle there in that traditionally, in the what I would call the classic corporate law context, a franchisor is usually not responsible for the actions or omissions of the franchisee. That's different, in an agency or distribution agreement, but that's not in this context. The first line of responsibility there is on the franchisee. But as franchisor, since they may have access to your networks or they've got your brand, there's a residual line of responsibility there to make sure that the franchisee is doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, anything else? I know that we went over time a little bit, but I just wanted to make sure we gave as thorough an overview as possible. All right, Tracy, I'll turn it back over to you then.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike, for the presentation. And again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to refer to that last slide for our contact information. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That one.